like, Luke, no one's going to come in if you look like you're going to beat them up.
Scared that one off.
You're calling it a dungeon, you're looking like a bouncer.
I mean, it is a dungeon.
At least Rich took the reins of civil.
Yeah. All right. Let's start.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for upstairs staying in the dungeon. We'll be giving you a talk on prehistoric ants and basically covering some of like the evolution of some of the overall family groups that we see, and just kind of running through some questions that we had when we were discussing some of the things regarding the prehistory of ants. So to begin with, what we're going to do is we're going to go through and do like a little glossary of some of the terms that we're using, because we're going to use quite a lot of various Latin names and things, and some people might know what they mean, some people might not. So hopefully this will give you some amount of familiarity with them if you don't have it. Down here, just to point out, so what we've got here, this diagram here is a very basic representation of the phylogenetic tree of various Hymenopteran species. So essentially, we'll go into more detail of it, but it shows kind of like when the various groups branched off from the main group. And then this here is just a basic representation of the geologic column, where you can kind of see roughly when various things first started appearing. So some of the terms we'll be using, amber is one of the main things we're going to be talking about, which is essentially fossilized tree resin. We've got a couple samples of amber just on the table here. They're the small ones down towards the front. But then something similar to amber that we've got is copal, which is essentially a younger form of amber, which we have a sample of in the big container just at the base of the lamp. The way I like to remember them is that amber is slightly older than Rip, and copal is slightly younger than Rip. And then we're going to be using the term eusocial, which is essentially a term to describe an advanced level of social communication and organization within various species. Formicidae is our scientific name for the general family that includes ants. We're going to touch a bit on Ponerinae, which is a subfamily of ants, often more primitive and tend to hunt more solitary. Hymenoptera is essentially the overall group that includes all our bees, wasps, and ants within the animal kingdom. Mutilidae is one that we'll mention briefly that came up in some of our questions, which is a family that includes velvet ants. And a term you might see briefly is MYA, which this essentially stands for millions of years ago. It's just a little abbreviation we like to use. So with this, basically, we approached it a little bit with a general kind of paleontological method, which is essentially we kind of discussed some things, did some reading and then analyzing of information. And with that, then we form and pose questions. And then with those questions, you kind of look for answers. So some of those, like a lot of the ones we came up with, we found had already been studied and already had answers. But in cases where those aren't studied and answered, that allows opportunities to do further research into that field and expand our base of knowledge. So these were the questions we came up with. The first one being, did ants originally express solitary behaviors more akin to velvet ants? Thus, did social behaviors develop later to help improve the survival of stressful situations? And do we have a good idea of the order of evolution between ants and other Hymenopteran species? Thinking along the lines of were velvet ants and solitary ant species without workers the original species model for both lines? And then our final question was, did the development of social behaviors reduce the strength of venom due to requiring development of chemical communications? So basically, the next couple of slides we're going to go over will cover those questions. So with the first question, basically, we discovered that ants, when they originally started appearing, did potentially display smaller eusocial behaviors. And yeah, one of the interesting things is that, like, while small scale eusociality would have evolved first, whether it evolved with or prior to Formicidae is still up for debate, but a lot of evidence does seem to indicate that the first appearance of eusocial behaviors within Hymenoptera was with the occurrence of Formicidae. Eusociality, however, is not a binary thing. It's not just you're eusocial or you're not. it's more grayscale. So you might have some species that are large communal colonies where you've got a single queen and thousands to millions of workers, or you might have a species that is just essentially a small sisterhood that kind of fight over the rights to lay eggs. So now I'm going to hand over to Rachel to give you a little bit of information on some examples of those.
Um,
Yeah, usually most of your pond-rain ants, i.e. Hapagnathus, Diacama, most of your bull ant species and some smaller groups, they're all very primitive and they display quite lacking social structures on a smaller level. They have smaller colonies. The physical difference between each caste is very limited, and they can often manage to continue without a dedicated queen. Gamma gates are just as useful to the colony. Other species, like these, are quite adapt to social hunting and gathering and don't really work together, whereas the rest of the Formicidae seem to have larger, more intelligent social structures. When you say about the stings in relation to the gases, you've got most of your pond-rain sting. The rest of the Formicidae, usually they say develop the acid for defense, but some species have managed to evolve again to use it as a weapon. Like the yellow crazy ants took over Christmas Island and gassed the crabs to nearly to extinction. So they've managed to take a next gap with something that effectively was designed for offence.
Yeah. So now moving on to our next question. Essentially, one of the first things we found when looking through is that typically animals do lose their energy intensive traits if they are not required. So, for example, venom is highly energy intensive because it's a complex protein that requires a lot of energy to be produced within the animal's body. And so, if it ever uses that for hunting or defense, it will take a while to actually replenish that. Um, and in terms of this with ant evolution, basically one of the things that seems to be present is if you have more ants, it gives you a quicker ability to kill prey, and therefore you don't need a high potency venom if you have venom at all. But that did lead us to the question of, do ants have venom or do they just spray acid? Which, as mentioned briefly by Rachel, depends on the actual family and the species. Some do still use venom, but when you look at the behaviors of those, they do tend to be more solitary hunting species, whereas those that do have acid, which is a lot simpler and less energy intensive to produce, tend to appear in the more eusocial groups. So ants did arise before we have strong evidence for communities of eusocial Hymenoptera. So they roughly appeared around about the Cretaceous period, somewhere between 140 to 180 million years ago. Now, this is quite a large period of time, and it's actually quite difficult to pin it down to any finer point of time because the chance of something becoming a fossil anyway is very rare, and the chance of something as small and soft-bodied as an ant becoming a fossil is even rarer. Because essentially, to get the amber that we have down here today, the ant has to be present on a tree and then get stuck in the sap of that tree. And then that bit of sap has to have long enough time to dry out and harden around the ant, and then it has to survive for nearly at least 140 million years to get to the present day. Which, when you consider the fact that we have earthquakes that happen, volcanoes that happen, mountains forming, there's a lot that can very easily destroy a piece of amber. So our evidence is fairly limited, and in terms of aging, it's quite difficult to get a specific age for various materials. So the best way we can age stuff is essentially we can get rough ages for the rocks around the material, and then looking at our stratigraphy, so where we had the geological column earlier, that essentially kind of roughly represents stratigraphy. So you might figure out a rock here comes from the Jurassic, and a rock from up there comes from the Cretaceous. So you know, if you find your amber here, you find it in the early Cretaceous, potentially just after the Jurassic extinction events. And when we were looking at overall species composition within Hymenoptera, it's actually quite surprising because we consider a lot of them to be social species. When you think of them, you imagine ant nests where they have queens and workers, wasps where they have queens and workers, and so on. But actually, a lot of Hymenoptera are pretty solitary, with about 3/4 of them fall within this category. So bringing up this again, as I mentioned, this is our basic phylogenetic tree. So a lot of our initial species were more wasp-like ancestors, and that's where we would start up here. And when we were looking at the behaviors, a lot of those early species are actually parasitic solitary animals. So as we know from modern behaviors, those solitary wasps, parasitic wasps, will fly around, they will find a target host, and they will inject them with venom. And then that venom will paralyze the target, and that will essentially allow them to lay their eggs within the prey. The larvae will hatch, eat their way out, and then they will go off in their own directions before eventually finding a mate, and then the cycle starts again. But when you get down to here, which would roughly be around our Cretaceous era where we find the Formistae appearing, what we start noticing, we do start finding evidence for eusocial behaviors within those ant species eventually. But with the wasps, it actually doesn't appear till a lot later after the Formistae have formed that eusocial behaviors appear in those species. So it's an interesting example of some convergent evolution where essentially two of the same behaviors appeared at completely different times in sort of a parallel to each other. So there's quite a lot of interesting things to discover when looking at this. But obviously, the problem is there's still a lot of stuff we don't know because it's very difficult to analyze a prehistoric ant. With modern taxonomy, we look at insects and we can perform direct dissections and manipulation of the body to look at the features and understand how to classify them. With our prehistoric ants, you'd have to try and get them out of the amber to do that in the first place. And if you tried to do that, when you look at the size of a lot of these specimens, they'd be completely destroyed trying to extract them from that material. But one of the things that we potentially have as a technique to start analyzing this information further is actually the use of CT scans. So it's not been done on ants yet, and it's only been used once with insects and amber. But at the Bonn University in Germany, they did a study on crystals that had been essentially classified with a Latin name that just meant mysterious because they had no idea how they really related to other beetles. But when they CT scanned them, they were then able to essentially perform these direct dissections and analysis of the models to help classify them better. And we now have a better understanding of where they fit in the evolutionary timeline. So hopefully we'll start using that on some of these Hymenopteran species to build a lot better understanding of the prehistory of these insects. So that's essentially everything we had to present today. So now we're happy to take any questions if you have any. Go on it.
If you could have any of the older ants that are no longer around today, which ones would you have?
Toss up. Tetranylia.
I mean, I'd personally go for the hell out the Hader Mermets because they're so unusual. It'd be interesting to see how they behave.
I know, I'm just obviously we play Ark and we terrorise, but then Tetra's on Ark and really want to see them. Real life.
Any other question?
On the CT scanning bit, is it money that's the blocker, or the technology's improving to help?
Money does tend to be a problem with a lot of research because I see a lot of it is either self-funded or relying on getting grants or funding from governments and other bodies. So a lot of it does come down to being able to find access to the equipment, being able to have money to afford to use the equipment, getting the specimens there and everything. So there's a lot that comes into it. And as I say, one of those things, it's just sort of fairly new to us in looking to use it. So we're starting to expand our uses of CT, but it's still relatively new in the field of paleontology. Any other questions?
So to be fair, there is holes and holes and holes of unidentified ants, bugs, and everything that just are lacking being described by anybody.
Yeah,
It just needs somebody to have the time or money or equipment to actually get them under a microscope and classify them properly.
Sounds really lost the time altogether.
Yeah, there are a lot of specimens and species that we will just never know about. Because when you think about them one day, we know that that will live on volcanoes, on mountains, and things like that. Those particular species are actually never going to fossilize because the geologic activity is just too high that all of those specimens will be destroyed by, you know, if an ant does somehow get stuck in a piece of amber on the side of a volcano, when that erupts, that's probably just going to completely melt and destroy the amber. And so you'll never know what species potentially lived on prehistoric mountain ranges. So always going to potentially have gaps, but hopefully we'll be able to figure out enough around it that our pictures will grow better over time. Go next.
But what was the biggest then?
You know this one.
How ants, isn't they? They officially come to the full size of a hummingbird, so up to 15 centimeters.
15 centimeters. Oh,
Biggest.
Be fun to keep one of those, wouldn't it?
I'll get stung by it.
not when it's nocturnal flights, isn't it? And then you've all got to stay in your houses.
Just
What-
put them, no flies out the door and leave.
Yeah. What ant today is closest to what was back then that we could keep as ant keepers ourselves?
Probably. It's one
You
of our
won't be able
most
to keep
primitive.
it though.
Is that very?
No, they're completely protected by the Australian government. If you touch one, you disturb their nesting sites, they will come at you with the full force of the Australian law. They are that rare.
But in
Have
theory,
about 400 to 500 less. Yes. You can get specimens, dead specimens of them, but they cost a lot of money and they're usually for like historical myrmecologists only.
Is that like are they called like Tyrannomonas or something?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they have very fun Latin names.
Yes.
T-Rex.
But otherwise, obviously, we've still got fairly primitive species like the Asian jumping ants, the Harpanaphil furniture, even some of the Vermecia and so on are pretty primitive in terms of the way they nest and produce their workers.
To be fair, the army ant and their offshoots go back quite far, same as leafcutters. They're very, very old.
How old? 50 million.
Not I believe it's older.
Well, 50 million is old enough. Like Rich is getting up there.
I still think it'd be fun to try and keep one of the colonies of army ants, like the ones forming proper, like, ants with their body.
Yeah.
I don't know how you would keep them, to be honest, but
With great difficulty.
you need a whole greenhouse for them, I think.
Because they move around.
Yeah.
Like they migrate.
They are their own nest. They make their nest out of their own bodies, basically.
Yeah, anything in play, they just go through it.
I'm gonna actually these dry rods.
Yeah. Any other questions?
No, thank you for an amazing talk. This was so educational. I loved it. Woo!
Thank you.